Hi, everyone. Welcome to the January 21st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's racing, which is a three-day Martin Luther King Jr. Day weekend, so we had some stakes on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. We'll begin at the Fairgrounds, talking about the major Derby prep that took place this past weekend. That was the Grade 3 Lecomte, also a race for the 3-year-old fillies down there, and some maiden allowance winners that we'll discuss from New Orleans. We'll move on to discuss some races from Aqueduct, including a couple of performances that could have ramifications on the Grade 1 Carter run later this spring. We'll then move down to Gulfstream to talk about some of the Sunshine Millions races, and we'll close things out at Santa Anita, where they ran some stakes this weekend, but I think the focus really was on an impressive maiden winner from Sunday, which we'll talk about at the end of the podcast. But for now, Craig, how's things going from this past weekend?
Things are going well. Turned out to be quite the busy weekend with plenty of races to talk about, even outside of the stakes races. But certainly the Fairgrounds is the place we want to start.
Yeah, for sure. That's where a lot of the stakes racing took place, and just a lot of races to talk about in general from that Saturday card, where there was just a lot of quality at every level. We'll kind of go in reverse chronological order, beginning with the last race of the day. That was that Derby prep, the Grade 3 Lecomte, going the mile on the 16th for the 3-year-olds. Not the fastest race in the world. It looked like a very competitive race coming in, and I think it did play out that way. Enforceable, who we had seen quite a bit of last fall, just seems like a horse that had the experience edge over a lot of these, and I think he used that experience to his advantage here because he worked out the right trip in a pretty congested field and just got the jump on some other horses, but I thought he ran pretty well to win this race.
He did. This was a race TimeformUS Pace Projector thought was going to be quick early, and it was pretty quick early. We have it highlighted in red. And I think you can see that even more so just by looking at the finishers. Of the top four, 3 of the top 4 were running 11th, 9th, and 12th. Early in the going. It didn't get the best speed figure, a 106 for the winner, which is, I mean, it's okay for 3-year-olds, but it that screams Grade 1 horse. But, you know, these are young horses that are developing. We'll talk about one of the allowance races earlier on the card, and I think even a maiden race that went a bit quicker than this one. So that kind of puts it in perspective. But it was a good first step for Enforceable. I know a horse I was against coming into the race, Mr. Monomoy, who didn't, he was bet down to 6-1, but he kind of turned my head a little bit in here just because he was the only one anywhere near the early pace that had a little bit of a say at the end. So, while I didn't like him going in, if you asked me for one going out, it would be Enforceable or him.
Yeah, it was a race that was really dominated by horses coming from a little farther back in the pack, though I do want to give Enforceable and Julien Leparoux credit because he didn't wait with this horse. He moved pretty early coming around the far turn, and I think it helped that he sort of got outside of horses away from the trouble that occurred inside, and we'll talk about that in a second with regard to Scabbard, who probably did have the toughest trip in this race. But Enforceable got the jump on a lot of others and was able to finish it off. I agree with you that Mr. Monomoy ran really well to be third here, just missing out for second over Silver State. Silver State, I thought, in just his third career start, stepped up and ran a decent race. He kind of got in behind horses coming to the top of the stretch, whereas Enforceable, who was behind him early, got the jump on him going outside. Ultimately, though, I thought Silver State had his shot in the stretch and just couldn't get to the winner. Mr. Monomoy obviously ran well. And regarding Scabbard, we'll see if Scabbard ultimately wants to go on in distance. I think the jury's still out on that. But he didn't have the best shot in this race because he was down inside as the pace was collapsing, had altered course multiple times during the stretch, got steadied briefly at about the 3/16 pole. Just not an ideal trip for the horse, but I guess I did want to see him run a little bit better even still.
Yeah, and you make a good point about Enforceable. When you're riding one of these closing type horses, just the timing of the move is so important and being clear when you do make your run. So I totally agree with you, and hats off to Julien Leparoux because, winning with these off the pace types is not always easy, particularly on dirt, and he rode this horse masterfully.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny. I was thinking back to Enforceable from last summer at Saratoga. There's this real reputation for that 1.125 dirt race that they run every so often at Saratoga, producing really good horses. I think 3 of the 4 winners have now been graded stakes horses coming out of that race, and Enforceable obviously won that race last summer. So just funny that a race that you would think wouldn't have a lot of ramifications on graded stakes later on, given how early they're running it, has produced some nice horses. Let's move on to the 3-year-old fillies run one race earlier in the Silver Bullet Day. Not a ton of quality in this field per se, but I think you do have to admire the winner, Finite's grittiness and just will to win races, because she looked like she was going to get swallowed up by the closers at multiple points during the stretch drive of this race, and she just refused to yield.
Yeah, both her and the early leader, who wound up being a runner-up, or Ursula, were pretty game through the lane and wound up 1-2 in a tight finish. Ursula actually looked like she might battle back and get the win, but it wasn't to be. That said, this wasn't a very fast race at all. Just a 99 Timeform US speed figure for the winner, Finite. I think you can credit some of that to the trip. She was basically wide around both turns and kind of forcing the pace a little bit, but all in all, I wasn't overly impressed with this one. I think her record, she's won quite a few in a row now, is probably one I'll be willing to take a shot against when she steps up and faces some competition, better competition.
Yeah, she feels like one of these horses that's going to continue to be a very short price in these Kentucky Oaks preps, and she just hasn't run a speed figure that makes her any kind of standout thus far. So if somebody's able to step up and run a faster speed figure in one of these races, they're just going to beat her. I mean, it didn't happen here, and I mean, she was 3-5 for a reason, because the competition just didn't look that strong, but you've got to think the quality of these races is going to rise as we get closer to the Kentucky Oaks. Staying at about the same distance on the dirt 2 races earlier, we saw the Louisiana Stakes, a grade 3 event now. I believe this race was elevated from a listed stakes race in past years. Silver Dust was the heavy favorite coming into this race and really just dominated. I mean, he got a perfect trip, stalking a pretty moderate pace, and this horse just has a really strong turn of foot. He's one that had originally come to prominence in slightly shorter races. He had shown some real ability around one turn, and he's able to use that sort of 7 furlong to a mile turn of foot in these longer races. And I mean, once they got to the 8th pole, there was just no way any of these horses were catching him.
No, and not to be a broken record, as good as this race looked on watching the replay and watching it live, I expected it to be a pretty decent figure in the 120s, and it just didn't result in that. He only got a 111 for the win. I think you could attribute some of that to the slow opening quarter mile, but again, I'm just not sure this was the strongest group of horses. I mean, he was 3-5. Some of the horses looked really poor. Gunnet down the lane, you had pointed out on the forecast, has trouble changing leads, and he did once again and just kind of fell apart late. Blended Citizen just kind of grinded up in the second, but like I said, not to be a broken record, but I just don't think this was the strongest race. He was 3-5 for a reason. I would expect him to run faster than the 111 when he shows up again next time. He did what he had to do, but again, not blown away.
Yeah, Silver Dust is a horse that's run faster speed figures in the past. The others, though, this was their chance to step up, and they didn't do it. They really couldn't get close to him, so I don't know if I'd want any of them moving forward. Moving to the turf, between these 2 races we just talked about, they ran the Colonel E.R. Bradley, which looked like a pretty competitive race on paper, but didn't turn out to be, as Don't Blame Rocket, who was 6-1 here, turned out to be a dominating winner in a faster speed figure than I anticipated this race would get. But I mean, I'm not surprised given the way he won the race. Got a good trip, sitting in behind a couple of speeds. The pace was honest, and he just took over with authority and never looked like a loser.
Yeah, this was a really good effort from him. He had won a couple in a row without running particularly fast, but I forget what exactly Andy Beyer, I've read all his books. And the one that deals with trip handicapping, I want to say he termed this trip something like the dream trip of life, where you just sit behind 2 dueling leaders, saving ground, tip out in the stretch, and blow by them. And that's what Don't Blame Rocket got. I'm not taking anything away from the performance. He got a 123 Timeform US speed figure, which is really solid for a grade 3, even moving into grade 2 territory. But again, he did get a dream trip. Not sure what the 2 on the front end were doing, laying it down so early. But as a bettor, it's good for me to see. I like when guys are aggressive early and set the pace up. And that fast pace does help with the speed figure as well. I mean, it wasn't super fast where all the fractions are coded in red, but it was certainly pretty solid for that turf course.
Yeah, it's a little bit ironic to me because somebody had said to me before the race that maybe they're going to use, or the Brad Cox barn was going to use Factor This as a rabbit for their favorite horse, Mr. Misunderstood. And I mean, they're different ownership, so I don't like to put a whole lot of stock in that stuff. But they did ride Factor This a lot more aggressively than I would have thought than they have in prior races. So that's curious. It turns out, though, I mean, if that's the case and they thought Mr. Monomoy was the stronger half of the run-coupled entry, it definitely wasn't true, because Factor This probably could have, I don't know if he could have won this race, but he would have made it a lot closer because he actually ran pretty well, all things considered, being used in the way that he was to still finish third. I mean, he finished ahead of the horse that he was chasing down, sailing solo. So I wonder if they sort of squandered an opportunity to get something with that horse, because if they had been a little bit more conservative with the ride, he probably would have finished at least second and probably close to the winner. But that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. Speaking of these faster speed figures, we saw one earlier in this Fairgrounds card, very early on, I believe in just the second race. A small field in the Duncan F. Kenner, scratched down to 3 horses, but we did see a special performance by the winner, Bobby's Wicked One, who just is almost impossible to catch when he gets one of these clear leads. And I know he was facing some decent horses in here, but Hog Creek also was coming off a layoff. I mean, he was a short price for a reason, and they were just never going to catch him.
No, in a 3-horse field against 2 horses that have very little early speed, to say the least. He was never going to be beat. He got a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, backed up the 129 he had run last time. I think we know what we have in this point with it. He's a need-to-lead type. He's always going to be a pace factor. I would imagine they're pointing him back to that race, and it just depends who else he can get free or not.
Yeah, I was looking through his past performances and thinking about his running style. And when he gets a clear lead, he's actually undefeated. He's 5 for 5. When he doesn't get a clear lead, he's 1 for 10. So he is a horse that can post these gigantic speed figures when he gets into a situation like we saw on Saturday. But I think it's always going to be difficult for this horse to step up in class because you just generally get more speed in these tougher graded stakes races with the sprinters. So we'll see what we get from him in the future. But I kind of agree with your assessment about his running style. Before we finish up the Saturday card, let's talk about one more pretty impressive speed figure that we saw from last weekend at the Fairgrounds, and that actually came on Thursday in an allowance race on that card. And Pirates Punch, who I believe we had talked about on the Pacecast last fall. I think we had mentioned one of his allowance races where he was a close second to Churchill Downs. And he's a horse who had really improved at the end of last year. And he just took his game to another level, first off the layoff here. The track was probably kind to his running style, but he ran a vastly improved performance from last fall.
He did. He ran a big number, a 126 TimeformUS speed figure, which is right up there with the best we saw all weekend, just a point below Bobby's Wicked One. It is a track, as you said, that seemed to be very kind to speed. Looking through the charts, I would tend to agree with it. I'd have to study a little closer, but we do have it coded in bright red. But there's no doubt about it. He beat some pretty solid horses in here, and he beat them easily. He won off by, I think it was over 11 lengths. And, he's still a young 4-year-old. He ran good as a 3-year-old, but as we've talked about, horses can and do mature quite a bit at 4 and even into their 5-year-old season. So in a division lacking any real star power at this time, you just got to keep an eye out for these horses. And he's the kind that looks like he could step in the graded stakes company if he could reproduce that effort.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about a few horses on this podcast that were former claimers that are really hitting their peaks right now. And he's certainly one of them because I believe he broke his maiden for a $30,000 tag. And ever since then, he's just totally turned his career around. I mean, he was bred to be a good horse. He's actually a half brother to Gervin, who was the Grade 1 Haskell winner from a number of years ago. So he's always had the pedigree to be okay. It's just taken him a while to figure things out. But based on this performance, he's a graded stakes quality performer. So it's going to be interesting to see where they go with him next. And let's now go back to finish up that Saturday card at the Fairgrounds, where we didn't see fast performances per se in the 3-year-old stakes races, but we did see a reasonably fast speed figure earned by some of the 3-year-olds in the maiden and allowance races. And that was certainly the case with Blackberry Wine, who won a race going the same distance as the Lecomte earlier on the card, that mile and a 16th in a nominators of 1 allowance race. The field looked like it had some promise coming in, and I thought this horse really stepped up to the challenge.
Yeah, he did. He got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. He had previously run a 107 in an off-the-turf race over a sloppy track. You never really know what to do with those performances, but I think they're going to keep him on the dirt after this one, as he showed he could handle a fast track as well. He had run a few times on turf, not nearly as well. And really, the top 2 threw down through the lane. It was a good, strong finish from both of them. The runner-up Digital, who was actually, I think, co-favored at 3-2, ran a 108 in here. So really nice effort from both of these. And I'd be interested to see if one or two of them show up in the Risen Star Stakes, which is next on the series at the Fairgrounds. As you said, it was a faster race than the Lecomte. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and it's not like Blackberry Wine was just walking on the front end. I mean, the pace of the Lecomte was faster than this one, but Blackberry Wine was setting an honest pace. And I know the chart says that Digital passed him by a half length at the eighth pole. I mean, it looked to me like Digital got about a length advantage over this horse at about the mid stretch point, and Blackberry Wine was just really game to come back and get the victory after that. Digital to me seems like a sprinter. He showed a lot of promise early on in 6 furlong races, and just based on his pedigree, I don't think he's one that wants to go this far. So, well, he's obviously a horse with some ability. I just think the distance, his stamina limitations were exposed at the end of this race. Blackberry Wine, on the other hand, he's bred to run all day. He's by Oxbow. The dam is actually a full sister to Tempera, who was a Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies winner for Godolphin a number of years ago. This horse is a half brother to Neo Classic, who's like a turf marathoner. So Blackberry Wine, I mean, the way he finished up this race and just the way he's run and the route races we've seen from him seems like he's going to go all day. So I don't know if he needs the lead to do it, but this was a promising performance for me. And just one other horse to mention out of this race is Chestertown, the $2 million yearling purchase. A New York bred who had shown some promise early on, still was pretty green in this race. They bet him down to be co-favorite with Digital, even though he hadn't run that fast yet. Seems like a horse that still needs to gain some experience, but it was just his third career start, so I guess he can do better.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point about Chestertown. It just goes to show how these 3-year-old races can work. He improved his speed figure 10 points, and it was still only good enough for a third-place finish in here.
Yeah, no, these horses can step up very quickly, and all of the top 3 did in this race. Wrapping up that Saturday card from the Fairgrounds, we'll talk about a maiden special weight race that took place sort of right smack dab in the middle of the card. Steve Asmussen had the heavy favorite in this spot, whose name was Earner, just took all the money first time out, but it was actually his other horse that got the victory. I believe Echo Town, the winner, was 13-1, just totally ignored on the tote board. But these two both ran well. Echo Town, though, earned a really encouraging speed figure for his debut.
He did. He got a 109, same as Blackberry Wine did, and I think both of the top 2 ran well. I was following along during these races, and our colleague Marcus Hirsch had actually pointed out that as promising as Earner was, his connections were a little worried. Maybe this was too short for him, but I think he ran really well. He just got ran down from behind, which isn't what you expect for a horse that they say a race is too short for, and I just think you got a couple really nice 3-year-olds here.
Yeah, and if you're comparing the two pedigrees, Echo Town arguably had the better pedigree because he's by Spitestown, who can just sire any type of runner, and he's a half to J-Boy's Echo, who I believe won the Gotham, I want to say, a number of years ago. So he's got the right to be precocious. I'm not sure how far either of these horses are going to want to go in the future. They might be more sprinter miler types, but they certainly showed plenty of ability in their debuts, and I don't imagine that Earner is going to be a maiden for much longer off this performance. Let's move up to Aqueduct to talk about their major stakes race from this past weekend. That was the Grade 3 Toboggan going the 7 furlongs and featured the return of Mind Control, who won the Grade 1 H. Allen Jerkins last summer at Saratoga, as well as the Grade 1 Hopeful 2 years ago, going the same distance as a 2-year-old. And he's looking to get back to be one of the top sprinters this year now as a 4-year-old. And he certainly got things off, started on the right foot. This was just a wild race to the finish, as coming down to the wire, it looked like any one of 4 horses could have won this race, and Mind Control just seems to have a nose for the wire because he always gets there first when he's in a battle.
Yeah, this was an interesting race as a speed and pace figure guy. It was very confusing. It was a race we had all the fractions coded in blue as not much pace. Looking at the fractions, there wasn't much pace. Still having fun making the lead in this field was certainly surprising to me, as I actually liked that horse in here. And I'm not knocking the ride because I always like the aggression, and the lead was there for the taking. He just wasn't good enough. What I would say is it just wasn't a very fast race. So I'm not going to take a whole lot out of this other than Mind Control ran pretty good. I think he's got bigger targets on his agenda. He probably got what he wanted out of this race. I didn't think he would be fully cranked, and the way he ran, he probably wasn't. I imagine he'll be on to a race like the Carter eventually where he'll have to run faster, but he certainly showed that he could. Again, it was a bit confusing when you look at the pace figures because the 2, 3, and 4 finishers all came from much further back in the field, but that easily could have been a point where the horses on the lead just aren't really front runners and didn't prefer that style.
Yeah, it reminds me of why we implemented the no speed characterization in the pace projector. And I don't believe this race was characterized as no speed coming into it beforehand, but it played out that way on the racetrack because anytime that you have a horse like Still Having Fun, who's a deep closer on the lead, it's not necessarily to that horse's advantage because that's just not his preferred running style. And it just kind of throws the entire race out of whack and puts everybody out of their preferred positions. Really, the only horse that got the kind of trip that you really expected him to get was Mind Control, who's sort of a stalking grinder type, and he was able to just wear this field down at the end. I don't know what to make of the closers in this race. Nicodemus and Sunny Ridge, I think they really did run well, and they arguably ran the two best races. Sunny Ridge made this blitz from last to looked like he took the lead briefly in the stretch at about the eighth pole before he just sort of hung at the end of this race. Nicodemus maybe had the toughest trip of all because he got shuffled back in the early going, had to move wide on the turn, and just couldn't quite get it done late. He lost sort of an unlucky bob at the end of this race. Regarding the speed figure, I don't know. The pace is so slow. It felt like it should have been a faster speed figure to me, but I can't really argue when I look at the numbers because I agree the last race is a little problematic because it does seem like the track maybe sped up a little bit at the end of the day. It's almost a race that would be a candidate to break out for pace, even though that's not something that I think you would ever want to do in a dirt sprint race because I know that wouldn't be beneficial over time. But I'm not going to be shocked if Mind Control can run a lot faster in the future. We saw another Greg Sacco trainee make his return from a lengthy layoff one day earlier on Friday as Mind Control's stablemate Jovia, who would last race in the Belmont Stakes when he finished third, cut all the way back from 1.5 miles to 6.5 furlongs, and he won first off the layoff over a pretty decent allowance field. I thought this was an encouraging start to the year for this horse.
It sure was. I mean, what a versatile horse he is. He can run long, he can run short. It wasn't the greatest speed figure, but again, I think it was probably pace related as the pace was pretty slow in this race. He did get a 112 for the effort. He beat a solid field. I mean, nothing great. Identity Politics has tried stakes a few times without much success. Mr. Dougie Fresh is a solid horse we see often run in New York. So he got the job done, and I'm sure there's bigger targets down the line for him, and I would definitely think he can run faster than he did. But he did it easily enough, and, I was impressed by it.
Yeah, and they've talked about how this is a horse they do want to stretch out in the future. I believe they're targeting a 1 mile stakes race next time out. I want to say the Stymie at Aqueduct in about a month's time. And I just liked the way that Jovia did it because it didn't seem like Junior Alvarado was really all out on him through the stretch. Just watching the horse's body language, he had his ears pricked for about the final 3/16 of a mile. And that just always says to me that a horse isn't all out in a drive coming down to the finish of a race. He was doing it pretty easily, even though he only won by a length. So this feels like one that can definitely take a step forward in the future. I didn't love the horses finishing behind him. Mr. Dougie Fresh probably isn't heading in the right direction. Identity Politics just never seems to win races, but I don't care about that so much because I think Jovia can do better in the future. One more allowance race to talk about from Monday's card at Aqueduct was certainly, for me, the most impressive performance that we saw in New York last week, and that was turned in by Wicked Trick in a starter allowance race going 1 mile. This horse has just completely turned his career around. I mean, I want to compare him to Cigar because just as Cigar was sort of stuck in a rut in turf races for so long at the beginning of his career, as soon as he got on dirt, he just started on this winning streak. And I mean, I know Wicked Trick is coming from a little bit lower down the class ladder than Cigar was, but I mean, he's ascending to a graded stakes level at this point because this performance that he turned in on Monday probably would have made him a winner of a race like the Toboggan.
Yeah, this is his 6th win in a row, I think it is. I think he ran second first time he moved back to dirt and hasn't lost since. And more impressively, his speed figures just keep rising. The last 4 have been 105, 109, 118. And then this one I just did this morning, it's going to be about a 121. And, he just won so easily. You're not sure where the limit is with this guy. He's definitely headed in the right direction. And I'd really like to see him get challenged and see what he's got under the hood.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in disbelief last summer when he won a pair of $16,000 claiming races on the dirt, because to me he looked like even cheaper than that based on his so-so turf form, and he's bred to be a turf horse. It's just kind of funny that he just keeps getting better on the dirt. It's a little counterintuitive, but I mean, Linda Rice knows how to handle a good horse. I know she had nominated this horse to the toboggan and decided to take the path of least resistance here, which I know Linda Rice can be a little cautious with which horses she runs in stakes races, but at this rate, I don't think she's going to be able to avoid running him in a stakes next time. And he seems like the kind of horse that should be targeting the Grade 1 Carter if he continues to be in this form. Let's next head down to Gulfstream, where they ran their Sunshine Millions card on Saturday, and we'll talk about a couple of the turf stakes races that they ran, beginning with the Sunshine Millions turf, which was won by the older class horse, March to the Arch, who was probably a pretty generous 5-2 in this race, because he really did have a significant edge over this field just based on his company lines coming into this race. Didn't have the best trip, was a little wide coming off the turn, but just kicked it in late and beat the claiming horse, Muggs-O-Matic, who really turned his career around before this.
Yeah, he did. I don't want to knock Muggs-O-Matic too much. He was a pretty recent claim from Jason Service, so we know how that works. You can expect the improvement. So when I first did the figures and saw the runner-up getting the 120, I had to go back and double check, but I'm fine with it now. I'm with you on this. I was surprised he was 5-2 compared to Curl and Zonner being only 2-1. He had come in as just a better, faster horse. He just didn't have those ones at the end of his running line. This was a race we have coded in blue. The pace was slow, so it definitely got a bit of a tough pace upgrade in here. And one thing to keep in mind when you look at these Gulfstream turf races, they run so many different setups with different rails, different run-ups for the same distance, even on the same rail, that a lot of these races get rated in isolation or only one or two races. So they're almost like class ratings. So that's basically what you're going to see most of the time. The pace figures and the speed figures do kind of work together. We do a good job of showing the shape of the race, but you're just never going to have a big sample size in these kind of races at Gulfstream.
No, that's a good note, because I know that those can be very frustrating for you with all those different configurations that they run. And March to the Arch, I mean, he just basically ran his typical race, and that was good enough to beat this field. It's funny, and I think about this a lot as a morning line maker. There's this weird phenomenon where some horses just are never popular with the public. They always seem like they're going to be shorter prices than they actually are. And March to the Arch is just one of those horses. They never bet him. He continues to run well. I mean, looking through his PPs, he was in a photo with Uni in the 4-star Dave for third last year, and he was 5-2 in this race against some claiming horses, which just goes to show you, horses can be overlays sometimes. I know we're both redboarding because we talked about this race beforehand, but I think we both would have been of the opinion that this horse is going to be pretty tough to beat in here if we had talked about it on the forecast last week. Let's move on to the filly version of this race. That was the Sunshine Millions filly and mare turf. And no surprise that Starship Jubilee just dominated this race on the front end as a short price. She was coming off a banner year in 2019 where she became a Grade 1 runner-up in Canada. I don't think she was out of the money in any of her races last year against top-level competition throughout the season. And she got some class relief here, and it showed.
Yeah, she ran well. She got a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. She's capable of better. This was another one where the pace was just ridiculously slow. I'm not sure sometimes. These are the races I just laugh at when you have a 2-5 favorite and they let her coast on the lead through easy fractions. It makes you wonder if they're just riding for seconds sometimes. But I don't know that anybody beats her anyway. I just would like to see it as a better. I'd like to see a little more enthusiasm from the riders on some of the other horses, because this race was over about 50 yards in.
Yeah, it does seem like often they're just conceding the win to a horse like Starship. And I mean, you don't want to see that as a bettor, but I mean, I guess that's a realistic way to look at it when you've got a horse like Star Jubilee who's eligible for one of these races. She's just a really good horse, and it's not going to be surprising to see her moving back up to graded stakes company very soon. Before we move on to the final venue, let's discuss one allowance race from Gulfstream Park, and that performance was turned in by Largent on Sunday. This is a horse who I think we had discussed about a year ago when he won his debut at Gulfstream, going 2 turns on the turf. Showed a lot of promise that day. I think he appeared one more time at Pimlico, like on Preakness weekend. Then he's been gone for a long time, but he returned in his 3rd start off a very long layoff here, and he looks like a pretty exciting prospect for Todd Pletcher off this performance.
Yeah, you're right. He had lost to Eons, who was a hot horse. That might have been Black Eyed Susan Day. He was a horse who was in really good form. Think he went up being a stakes competitor. Only lost by a neck that day. He showed up this time as a first-time gelding, and boy, did he look good. He got a 118 Timeform US speed figure, so not very far off a horse like March to the Arch, who just won on Sunshine Millions Day. It was a quick pace. He was sitting off a kind of runoff leader, just sitting all by himself in the clear. And, I thought it was a pretty good effort from him, and I think he's got a bright future with it. I don't know if it was the gelding or what was going on there, but he did look like a real professional horse.
And that's not a kind of trip that I really like, when you've got a runoff leader and the horse that's sort of isolated in that first spot chasing that horse. It's just kind of in no man's land because he doesn't have a real target, and he's not connected with the rest of the field to sort of gauge how fast you're running. I don't like that trip normally, but Largent really had no problem with it, made the first move after that leader. Everyone loves James, and behind him, the race really did mostly fall apart. I mean, the other horses that were chasing that pace didn't do too well. So, off this performance, I think Largent is definitely a horse that we'll see in a graded stakes next time, and rightly so, because the speed figure he earned here is going to make him tough in one of those races next time out. Let's finish up at Santa Anita, where we'll begin by talking about 2 graded stakes races, although not sure we saw graded stakes type performances in these races, beginning with the 1.5 mile Astra Stakes from Sunday. Miss Paintor was the winner of this race. I believe coming into this performance, she was still eligible for a non-winners of 2 allowance, so she was a price horse for a reason. She just seemed to handle the extra distance in a race where not many of these horses had gone this far before, and I think stamina became a real issue late in the stretch.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't a very strong race. None of these Santa Anita races we're going to talk about do I have official speed figures for. My assistant does that, but I kind of gave a best estimate looking at the worksheets we use, and I think she's going to get about a 115. On speed figures, she came in just as good as anybody else in this field. And like you say, I think it was the distance that made the difference. All the rest in the stretch just seemed to fall apart and have nothing left.
Yeah, and it seemed even like the second place finisher, Tiny Tina, was loaded coming to the top of the stretch, and she peeled out, got a great ride, looked like she had dead aim on the leader in the final 1/8 of a mile, but she just couldn't produce that kick that she can produce going shorter distances over this 1.5 miles, and I think just stamina had everything to do with that. Sticking with this same filly and mare turf division, we saw another grade 3 event for these horses on Monday's card at Santa Anita. This one's going a little bit shorter, though, in the grade 3 megahertz. They were just running over a mile. And the winner of this race, Caressa, was actually making her first career start on the turf. I was looking up her pedigree before the race to try to make a case for her, and she really doesn't have any discernible turf pedigree on the dam side. It's really all dirt. She is by Uncle Mo, so maybe that's all the turf pedigree that she needs, but John Sheriff certainly had the right idea to try turf in this ambitious spot because she lived up to the hype. She ran her career best performance, and I mean, it looked like the closest were going to come to her in the stretch of this race, but she just kicked on pretty gamely and won as the best horse.
Yeah, she did. It was an interesting move. She had won an allowance race at Del Mar easily with a good figure, and it had proven to be a pretty strong race. The runner-up had already come back to win with an improved speed figure. But John Sheriff's actually really knew what he was doing because she elevated her speed figure quite a bit once again to run about a 116 in here is what I'm going to guess. She looked really good doing it, and I don't think there's much doubt that she preferred the turf to what she'd been doing on dirt. So he's got himself a really promising, versatile horse in here, and it will be interesting to see where she shows up because, as we've seen, the division isn't all that strong in California. We saw it on Sunday at the longer distances, and even this race didn't look particularly good coming in, but she sure looked good coming out of it.
Yeah, I don't want to go overboard because in the grand scheme of things, this wasn't a particularly fast speed figure for this turf division across the country. I mean, it's maybe fast for the division out in California, but this horse is going to have to step up against some tougher horses if they if they decide to try tougher races with her. And it does seem like in this turf division out in California with the fillies and mares, I mean, when Basilica's not running, the rest just seem to take turns beating each other. The one horse I do want to mention out of this race that didn't have a great trip is Keeper of the Stars. If you see her coming back in a similar spot next time, rewatch her trip in this race because things just didn't work out. Her rider put her on the lead, then decided to take back, and she just continually got shuffled back throughout the race. She's one to look for next time out if another race at this level doesn't come up that tough.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. That's a trip that it drives me insane. If you're going to go for the lead, go. I'm not sure what the guy was doing on this one.
Yeah, I didn't like that either, having been a little bit interested in her coming into this race. Let's close things out with a maiden race from Sunday at Santa Anita that got a lot of people talking. This horse was no shock. He was bet down to odds on. Nadal, a first-time starter for Bob Baffert, going 6.5 furlongs on the dirt. And he lived up to the hype. This was an impressive performance. I mean, just from a physical standpoint, he towered over the competition. I mean, he just seems like a real imposing presence. Wasn't the quickest out of the gate, but he showed good speed, widened onto field in the stretch. We'll see what he does stretching out, but this was the right way to start a career.
It was. I wouldn't think he'd have much trouble being by Blame, but you would know that better than me. The people that follow me on Twitter know I'm a huge tennis fan. I play tennis most days of the week. I'm not a Rafael Nadal fan, so I'll probably have trouble rooting for this horse. I'm more a Novak Djokovic fan. But there's no doubt about it. It was a good effort. I will be interested to see the figure my partner sends back. It wasn't an easy one to make. There wasn't a whole lot of dirt racing on Monday. There was only a couple sprints, including the 5.5 furlong distance was one of them, which is never an easy comparison for some reason to other distances. But I'm going to guess these horses going to get about a 109. I saw he got a 98 Beyer speed figure, so we're not coming in quite as impressive as what Beyer did. So I will put on Twitter what he ran, but watching visually, it was every bit a good performance. As you said, he was physically a very good-looking horse. He was kind of built like the tennis player Nadal, who's just a big, strong guy and overpowers a lot of his competition. And, you know, as we know, Bob Baffert can get a horse ready quickly. He did it with Justify. And if anyone could turn a horse like this onto the Triple Crown trail, it would be him.
Yeah, and the hype that we're seeing about this horse coming out of the race is almost rising to that level that we heard about Justify after he won his debut. Justify did objectively run, I think, a little bit faster, certainly in the TimeformUS speed figure scale, but I think on the Beyers as well when he made his debut. So this horse, while he did run an excellent race, he's going to have to do a little bit better, I think, when he steps up against the graded stakes foes that I think will be coming in the very near future. But I mean, not a whole lot faster because this was a really nice maiden victory. And regarding the stretch out that I think is inevitable at this point, I mean, as you mentioned, he's a son of Blame who's a really versatile sire, can get dirt turf horses going short and long. The dam side, there's a ton of stamina. I mean, the dam herself is a half-sister to Soul Search, who was second in the Grade 1 Spinster, third in the Grade 1 Personal Ensign, going 1.25 miles. This horse's second dam is by Pleasant Colony and is a full sister to Pleasant Stage, who was a very good horse from the early 90s. I believe she won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. So it's all route pedigree on the dam side. So we'll see what this horse does stretching out, but seems like it could be another one of these Bob Baffert monsters that he's unleashed early in this 3-year-old season of his.
Yeah, a couple other things on this race. I do want to say that I thought Exalted ran pretty well. He was the runner-up. He didn't do a lot of running early, but he's one to watch as well. He's going to get a fairly good figure coming out of here. His trainer, Peter Yurton, he doesn't really send him cranked out, so it kind of a sneaky good performance by him. And I don't want anybody to think I'm comparing this to Justify's debut, where he actually got like a 132 TimeformUS speed figure. So he ran a Grade 1 type figure for older horses in his maiden win. So Nadal wasn't quite at that level by any stretch, but still a good effort.
And as you were alluding to, one of the difficulties of making a figure in this race is that it was primarily first-time starters. And I think even you would say this is one of these that you've got to monitor going forward because, these horses can improve a lot, but also it's hard to know how to gauge these races when they're all making their debuts.
Right, particularly when it was between turf races like it was. Unless you're there and making notes, you don't know what they did to the track or if they worked on it. And even if they did, you don't know how it's going to affect the horses. So therefore, there's very little to go on this race. You just have to trust that it's in line with the other races. If it makes sense looking at it, if it came up that it just was, going to get a 70 speed figure, I'm going to say, well, I know that's not right, and I'm going to break it out somehow. But in this case, it looks reasonably close to the others, and I would imagine that's what my assistant will go with.
Well, that's all the racing from this week. We'll follow all of these horses in the coming weeks and months, both those that ran in the stakes and these up-and-coming maiden and allowance winners that are pretty exciting prospects. We will, of course, be back on Friday to do the TimeformUS forecast, and I imagine we're going to talk quite a bit about the Pegasus World Cup card, which is coming up this Saturday. That's one of the big highlights of the winter season, so I imagine we'll do those stakes races, including others from around the country, when we do the TimeformUS forecast. As always, you can listen to both of these podcasts on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form and check us out on Tuesday and Friday. So thanks for listening today, guys, and we'll be back to do some handicapping on Friday.